Hi, everyone. This is Andy Stewart, and I am so very excited to be joined today in a conversation about my novella, We Shall Sing a Song into the Deep, with two very awesome guests. Diana M. Foe is a Hugo Award-nominated editor and was the acquiring editor for this piece at Tor.com. She is currently a story producer for Serial Box as well. Robert Penner is a speculative fiction author whose novel Strange Labor was released last year to much acclaim. He is also the managing editor for Big Echo, and easy and specializing in critical science fiction. Thank you both so very much for joining me today. I've been really looking forward to this conversation, so it's awesome to have you here.
Yeah,
Glad
thank
to be
you
here.
again for having us here.
Um, I got so much I want to talk about or ask you about, and I know we don't really have the time, so I've narrowed it down to just a few things, and I'm gonna just start with one thing that I feel is kind of at the heart of the book, and that's sound,
Uh-huh.
and noise and orality. I don't recall ever reading a spec fic book in which the universe was just composed to such a degree out of sound.
Mm,
So like when Remy wakes up at the beginning of the book, she's almost vibrating and the submarine's vibrating.
hmm
And one of the central organizing tropes is music and the choir, right? And language even in the book sort of deconstructs into sound a lot of time too, like the very use of Latin, so much
hmm
Latin that most people don't understand,
hmm
and the choir and the whale song. So sound and music and melody emerging out of what seems like static or noise is a big theme in this book. And even the choir functioning sort of as a metaphor for society that's can be threatened by internal harmonies and external forces, yada yada yada. My point is there's a lot of sound. There's an awful lot of sound and noise and music. And I was wondering um, how and why that came about, whether that was the origin of the story or if it was something that emerged later as you were writing, or if there's sort of personal reasons for all of that. But sound, so much sound in this book,
Hmm.
and beautiful sounds too. Uh,
Well, thank you. It's a great, yeah, that's a loaded and a great question. There's a lot to unpack there. I, when you think about these classic submarine movies, um, all the tension is about sound, like sound and noise too. In the dark and in the water, right? Sound is how we see, right? In darkness, not just in water, but in darkness and in the sea. Sonar and everything. So sound is definitely a that's how one is identified. That's how you find each other, right? And and I think that this kind of goes to the to one of the origins of this whole piece, which was a documentary I watched many years ago called Into Great Silence. A fantastic documentary. Is 2005, and the filmmaker eludes me right now. But it was a for the first time ever, a documentary film crew was allowed into the Carthusian monastery in France, and they just kind of let the cameras roll, and there was so much silence in that film. There's, as far as like vocal silence, but the background sounds and were profound. Just the ambient noise in the day to day life in nature was profound. But the figures themselves, there were these great moments where they would just look at the camera and not speak, uh, and and uh, um, and then whenever they would sing the hours, because they observed the hours, all of a sudden the sound just seemed deafening, and it seemed so full in the way in the comparison, so much silence. And so I think marrying those two together, right? The idea of the deep, of the dark, and sound meaning so much and being so powerful in that setting, along with that liturgical, with that prominence of sound in the monastic setting,
was it, Diana, when you were editing it, is that tricky when, like, I mean, as especially with the Latin and the melody and the music, is it a it's pretty alien to me to write that way. So I was just curious, when you're working with a text like that, and you're sort of moving between sort of oralities and even sometimes the written text being sort of deconstructed into noise. Is that something you're aware of when you're editing a text like that, or is it just words on paper? I'm just curious about the process of how you process a text like that.
Yeah, I think, especially when I did the first read on submission. I always, when I read submissions, I read it first as a reader, and just letting the words kind of wash over
Mhm.
me, kind of trying to be immersed in the story. Like, is it immersive? It's actually a huge, point for me when I'm acquiring something, that if I am bored at any point in the story, it's a big warning sign that, like, if I don't think it's fixable, then I don't think it's the right story for me. So, and because I
Mhm.
approached, you know books first as a reader, it makes me think, like, what would be the experience. And so part of what really drew me into Andy's world is the fact that simultaneously there's so much familiarity with it. It's a coming of
Right.
age story. It's a story that has a mystery at its heart. It's about, like, this weird end of the world scenario, yet not. um, and at the same time, there's so many elements that felt alien, and of another
Mm.
country, I guess, is the best way to put it. And having, I don't have a Christian background. I have never, like, really gone to church or anything like that. So that is also, like, an element of me as a reader going in and just being immersed into this environment that is so spiritual,
Right.
and how sound and echoes played a part of it. And I could imagine in my head what it was like to be in, like, this really regimented, contained realm where your senses and your sense of, like, the greater world were so limited.
Mhm.
But those elements, like having, regular, religious rituals throughout the day, like having to act a certain way and perform yourself, like the act of singing, um, and how the use of sound is just flourishing in light of, like, all these other limitations that really impacted me as a
Right.
reader, and definitely, was one of the key points of why I felt so invested in the story. And so when editing it, that is when I turned my editor brain on and be like, all right, so does one, um, I enjoyed it as a reader, but does it still make sense?
Mhm.
And that can totally be a taste thing. Like when you're editing something, based on your experience as an editor or your life experience or what have you, you could be like, it makes sense to me, but would a reader going cold into it, would they be confused? Would they
Mhm.
not understand the point of the story? Would, they encounter so many roadblocks that they just get bored and they put it down, you know?
Right.
Um, so, and I also think about the world building. Like, does all the elements to it make sense in context of the story that the author's trying to tell and the world that they're trying to shape? Um,
Mhm.
so, having things like the Latin and this, the choral singing, and even, like, knowing that this was a, a warped translation of religion. Like, there's no, like, chaplains don't really exist,
Hmm.
and, like, the mashup of, like, the nautical, hierarchy with the church hierarchy. Like, to me as an editor, it was important for that to make sense to a reader so they could figure it
Right.
out. um, and they don't automatically assume, like, oh wait, yeah, that's how the Navy works, or like, yeah,
Uh-huh.
that's how a church, a monastery works. Like, understanding that there's a blend of them both was something I thought about a lot.
It is
And I
this.
thought that Andy did really well.
Thank you.
Well, the juxtaposition, that startling juxtaposition between the submarine and the religion. I mean, it's very smooth in the book. It is. If you just say it, it's like, oh, all right. But it does. You guys did manage to make it completely smooth and very easy to follow. The other thing I was wondering about it, that juxtaposition, and you were referring to it yourself just now, is on the one hand, the religion creates this sort of this framework or this institution where the music can take place, and you have like Remy's few moments of joy in the book, at least in the first 2/3, are singing. And so it's the religious institution that makes that possible. Yet what Diana just referred to, this sort of this repressive aspect of religion too, right? Where it's also this incredibly controlling and exploitive structure. I thought you guys did a really good job of keeping that balance and that contradiction like even, and really like it made the plot, I think, a lot more propulsive. That tension. That's, I guess, not a question or anything. It's more an observation. But how conscious are you guys, like when you're working on a text like this, of those kinds of like oppositions and tensions? Like, is it Do you find yourself as an editor and a writer sort of trying to smooth things or like highlight them or like really punch them?
Yeah, well, just this touching on both of these responses too, is that one of the big things about a piece like this is, there uh, it's quite laid out, the liturgy, right? The hours, the singing of the hours, and so it was a really big choice about what do you choose, what do you keep, what do you take, and what do you choose to share in the writing itself. And because I don't want to squeeze out the reader, like I don't want to, like Diana, you're mentioning too, you don't want to shut down the reader, you don't want to push them out with too much, I guess I would say, minute detail, too much of the um too much of that. And so I think it was really important to find that balance of like just touching on the world, these, looking at these elements as world building elements, to just enough to tinge it, to touch it, to create a structure, and to give us the auspices of this order and this structure. But I don't know, Diana, did you have something to jump in on, or?
Yeah, I mean, what and I'm going to jump on your comment about joy too. One of the interesting parts that really made me keep reading was aside from like the central mystery about I don't know how spoilery you want this talk to be, but there's
Oh,
a central mystery that has to do with like a devastating secret that falls into Remy's hands, and
right,
it's her decision that could possibly change the world.
right.
Um, so and so besides like figuring out like what's going to happen next, like who's going to find out this secret, and there's multiple secrets in this book aside from that one that keep unfolding, and I think like one of a really strong story structure is making the reader constantly ask questions themselves
Mhm.
about either like a new piece of information about the world or about character motivations or just plots. As long as the reader still has questions about what is going on in a way that is not confusing but compelling,
Mhm.
that is really one of the elements that can make a very compelling story. Like it's
Mhm.
not the only one,
Yeah.
but it's definitely something that was central, I think, to this particular story. Um, and having the contrast too between this unfolding of various mysteries and enigmas, and at the same time in a world that feels on the surface very cut and dry,
Mm.
very like it is how it is, everything is structured, everything has a process, trust in the system as some might say.
Right.
um and having that be the central tension, like knowing that Remy has to struggle against being taught these things for most of her life,
Right.
um is a driving force of the story too.
Yeah, I think also touching on initially what you had mentioned about hope, and I wanted to bring this up too, is like I did want to make sure that there was some room for hope in this book. I think that whereas I think I mentioned before in some early discussions about my kind of background growing up in Waco, Texas, where the Davidian cult, uh, ordeal happened whenever I was in fourth or fifth grade. And then I attended a private Baptist university, and it was a choir. It was a singer in the choir for years in that institution. And um, I learned a lot about the structure of religion, its oppression, but also there's the community and the beauty in it too. And I think um, there's something about that I really wanted to make sure I was touching to balance the darkness of it, the grittiness of it. I remember whenever I let my agent read it, he was like, I really like it. He's like, it's a little gritty, it's a little dark. And it's like, it is, yeah, it is. But and obviously he saw that too, but there is like hope and a little bit of balance of light. And I think maybe that comes back around to one of the questions you were asking earlier, Rob, is that balance. I'm trying to still find that balance. I think that's important.
I definitely agree that as an editor too, there I remember a few years ago someone making a comment about like oh, like during these tough times, at least we'll get good art. And I'm like, well, what does that exactly mean? You know, it could mean a lot of things. It could mean the fact that, you know, artists' jobs are, you know, providing a pulse for the current moment.
Mm,
And, you know, and maybe that is a driving factor, like all these outward, you know, conflicts in the world, all the current events, all the feelings of like, you know, of bleakness, basically. Like, is it an artist's job to comment about that? Is it their job to fight against it? Is it
mm,
their job to serve as a parallel for it for future generations who might not remember? um and and I do think that, you know, my taste does run that I tend to be drawn towards stories that have greater commentary, whether it's political and social commentary or an echo of, you know, the human condition. And what, um, you know, this novella really does well is, I think it's able to contextualize something that feels entirely fantastical, but also completely relatable to our current moment
mm-hmm.
emotionally. Um, you know, and I think readers will definitely be drawn to that. And having that hope be a part of it you know, I think is integral to the structure of the novella to make it work. Um, and it's also part of like the satisfying reader experience is to know that, you know, oftentimes I think the appeal of dystopic stories, um, it lies in the fact that they're not actually like dystopia as like academically, like the genre of dystopia. You know, it's typically a cautionary tale that does not have a happy ending. If we think of like 1984, if you think of Animal Farm, if we think of, you know, more recent ones, you know, like Severance by Ling Ma,
Oh,
or this YA novel I keep thinking about all the time, called Feed by MC Anderson.
mm,
None of them have happy endings.
mm-hmm.
You know, those are all true dystopias. They all have commentary, you know, about the world gone wrong. And part of the power of true dystopic fiction is the fact that it's not fixable. Like, there is no turning point. Um, and what I think a lot of writers are doing now, especially, you know, in We Shall Sing a Song to the Deep, is that you can have the dystopic moments, but what is the benefit of knowing that there's no way of turning back?
Mm-hmm.
You know, the benefit of knowing something is cautionary, is the fact that it is cautionary and there's something that you can still fix.
Right.
And I think right now readers are just looking for stories, you know, that offer something else
Mm-hmm.
when they feel like they can't immediately figure out what the fixable answer is.
Mm-hmm.
Because that's the real reality, is like we don't know exactly how
Mm-hmm.
to fix things right now. So what are we actually looking for in the books and the stories that we consume?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, Rob, what do you think about that? Yeah.
What do I think?
Yeah.
I'm very curious about both of you guys, like, are talking about historical context and hope, and it's an alternative history rather than like a science fiction or like a pure fantasy.
Mm-hmm.
So I'm just curious, and I know Diana, you've got a wealth of professional expertise in like steampunk and this kind of alt history kind of thing, and Andy does a lot of alt history. And I'm just curious about that, about you guys are talking about historical context and hope, and you're both very familiar with this kind of this turn towards alternative history as opposed to just science fiction or whatever. It's just fascinating.
Yeah, I think alternative history, that's I've been thinking a lot about that. What's the difference between alternative history? Why alternative history? Maybe it touches on what Diana you were saying a moment ago. It's like, you know, you know, a a, a post-apocalyptic or a one of these kind of stories are stories, or dystopian stories are ones that, you know, you can't change the larger context, right? You know, but yeah, maybe alternative history gives us a lens to, I don't know, in a way it's following our worst, you know, the worst case scenario, like, you know, when these moments when life could have, you know, at least that's why I'm so interested in Cold War alternative history, especially in things like in the Cuban Missile Crisis era and in the height of Cold War kind of stuff too. Um, you know, following that thread of worst case scenarios. I don't know. Um, uh, it's but there is a corrective, like maybe in looking at an alternative history and looking at how bad it could have been. maybe it makes me feel better about how, well, it wasn't that bad. Like maybe life isn't that bad. Maybe it's almost encouraging in a way. I don't know. I don't know why I'm trying to like break down my own psychology, my own predilections with that. But yeah, what do you think, Diana?
Yeah. I think one of the draws, in particular to like alternate history and also, historical fiction and time travel. I'm gonna like link all these,
Sure.
three concepts in a second.
Mm-hmm.
Is the fact that um, when you think about why people like historical stories, there's a lot of reasons. It could be the aesthetic. It could be because they have a vested interest in that particular time period of history. And it's also the great thought experiment. Like if I lived during then, what would I do?
Mm-hmm.
Same thing with time travel stories. Time travel stories, I think, also deal with history in a way that it's still like fixable. And the premise of those stories, I think, is based on regret. Like, I
Mm-hmm.
regret making this mistake in the past. If I had the chance to fix it again, how could I do it?
Mm-hmm.
And alternate history kind of combines both of those concepts. It's the fascination of this factual reality that had existed at one point, also dovetailing with this collective question we have as a society and as individuals about what would we do to correct our past regrets.
Mm-hmm.
And since, as far as we know, like time travel isn't real, alternate dimensions could be real. There is science behind that. But the simple thought experiment of people being self-reflective about their actions and their impact in the world, and how those gestures like echo in ways that cannot be anticipated. I think people are very drawn to those aspects.
Diana talking about time travel, like linking all those genres or subgenres together, and they're all about time and regret. I'll set aside the regret, but the time, the whole book in some ways, the novella is structured about like different sort of streams of time. It's like, it's if you were to like really step back, it's a story about like synchronicity and syncing time up, right? You have this, and from the very beginning of this conversation, talking about the sort of the quotidian life, both of you talked about the quotidian life of a monastery, where like this day-to-day highly in this bubble, you have this bubble where you have this timeless procedure, these highly ritualized things happening, and then occasionally they sing, and it kind of those, it's the sound that links them up to sort of this mystical sublime ocean, right? This timelessness outside them. So there's this bubble where nothing's moving, it's just ritual, and they're trying to get into this timeless void. And then at the same time, on the top side, there's this, I guess, sort of political historical time stream, right? And that they're trying to destroy. And so it's kind of Remy's story, like after talking to you guys and thinking about time, I mean, maybe it's this idea of her emerging out of this timelessness and syncing up, right? And even in the last few scenes of the book, it's like there's literal synchronizations going on. And it was just useful to hear you guys talking about time in the way you were, to start thinking about what the book itself is structured like in terms of time.
And it was, this might be obvious to some readers or not, but the whole book is structured on the liturgy, on the hours, right? And matins and terce and lauds, right? And so, and each section actually was intended to be a reflection on the religious meditation of that hour, actually. So you're right about that comment on time, and I think that's something I hadn't even thought about myself with this book, is that it is that internal time, that endlessness, which almost I worried about would be too maybe this is not the book for this time of pandemic time, where everybody is, most people are kind of still caught indoors and working on a quotidian kind of lifestyle in a structure and a rhythm that might be unending, that might feel a little bit, confining. I hope that doesn't, feel too oppressive for the reader. But I liked what you were saying, Rob, about Remy syncing back up with it in the end, and that really is that release. I think, not to give away the the book too much, only to say there's more hope perhaps than we think there will be, by the end. And there is that synchronization. There is that moment of linking up a time. That's a cool way of thinking about it. Yeah.
Yeah, I definitely that was a really great observation too, Rob. Especially the fact that like, you know, the construct of time itself, like it can arguably be, just a fact of human perception, but it's also a physics fact. It's a reality. It's a dimension, and you making the observation that about how dimensions could be broken through. It's just all a matter of perspective. I think that is a really great way of interpreting the
Mhm.
ending, especially coupling it with Remy's coming of age
Mhm.
and her realization into
Hmm.
adulthood.
Right, right, right.
Right.
Yeah, breaching out of that closed world and this closed this construct. Yeah, and then emerging autonomous, independent. Yeah, yeah. Well, thank you so much, both of you, again, for joining me today in this conversation. I just want to, Rob. Uh, I think we talked about this before we started recording, but Rob and I would trade pages. We lived in the same town
Yeah.
for a number of years, and I had the privilege of at the same time reading pages for his novel, Strange Labor, which came out last year. He was reading and critiquing my pages for this novella, and it in your insight was just so helpful and really helped me to find, this is advice to any writer out there. If you haven't heard it already, find your community, find your people, find people to share your work with, find people who are smarter than you to share your work with, and the benefit of that is just amazing for any writer. Just great advice
And get a
there.
good editor.
And a great, that's exactly. And next was Diana. Thank you so much for whenever, it's any writer's dream to hear, such enthusiasm from an editor saying, I get what you're doing. I like what you're doing. I am excited about what you're doing, and I want to work with you on that. And that was just it's just a dream come true. And I was so very, very happy to work with you, at least for a time on putting this piece together. And you really helped to hone that uh, this piece, and I think made it sing ever more clearly. And again, thank you.
Working on the book has been an absolute joy. And knowing that other readers have the opportunity to experience what I experienced and what Rob experienced is just even more exciting.